So with the PTR for Season 4 of Diablo 4 finally being out, we can test all of the massive overhauls coming with this season, and one of the biggest pieces of these overhauls being what are basically Hell Tides 2.0. And I just have to say right off the bat that these changes to Hell Tides are incredibly good. They've changed Hell Tides from being more of a chore or something that's not that interesting to being an incredibly fun part of the endgame. And not only are they just going to be a lot more rewarding with a lot more variation in them, but they're also just going to offer a lot more difficult and interesting content. Now to start off, if you didn't play in Season 3, Hell Tides got a pretty major change there as well, where instead of being on for an hour, then off for an hour, then back up the next hour, now Hell Tides are on for an hour, they'll have a 5-minute downtime, and then another one will spawn. So they're up almost all of the time, you're just gonna have to wait 5 minutes, you can go back to town, do some crafting, clear out your inventory, and the next one will be up. And then they also pretty heavily buffed the living steel you'll be getting from all of the different chests, which are used to summon and defeat Grigori, and he will drop items that you need to go face Duriel. So these are very important, and they got pretty heavily buffed last season as well. Now, one of the big pieces of this overhaul is massively increased monster density and just having a lot of small events you can go do at any area in the Helltide, and having a lot more randomly spawning events. One of the biggest ones you'll notice now is a big hell worm will pop out of the ground and just spew out dozens of enemies, including a bunch of elites. And this can spawn basically directly on top of other packs. So if you're already facing a big pack of enemies with a bunch of elites, this worm can pop out and just spawn a ton more enemies, massively increasing the density. And because it's spawning in so many elites, and because all elites now have low chances to just give you pretty much every rare resource in the game, this can also be a pretty big increase in just getting any of the materials or rarer boss summoning mats throughout the entirety of the game. And likewise, there's going to be a bunch of other small events or interactable objects scattered throughout the Helltide. If you played in Season 2 and did the Blood Harvest, a lot of the things from that were brought into Helltides. So you'll find like random totems you destroy and it'll spawn some elite and give you a bunch of materials, to kind of smaller versions of the open world events that's just like killing one enemy or destroying some random structure. And most of these small little events or interactable objects usually just end up spawning a bunch more enemies and a handful of elites. So Helltides will feel like they have massively increased density for the majority of the time. And while you're running around killing all of these enemies with a massively increased density, you'll be building up a threat meter that's split into 4 different sections. And every time you get to a new section in this threat meter just from killing enemies, it will usually spawn a smaller pack of enemies on you and give you a warning that your threat has been increased. Now, once you fully fill up the threat meter, you'll spawn in an event on yourself. Now, what's going to happen is just massive groups of enemies, including tons of elites, are just going to keep spawning on you. And as you kill all of these elites and waves of enemies spawning on you, your threat meter will continue to decrease. Now, once your threat meter fully empties, a Hellborn mini boss will spawn. And these are Hell versions of the Bloodborne from Season 2, which are basically copies of any of the playable classes in the game, just in a boss form that's super strong. So you could get a Barbarian Hellborn that's using Barbarian abilities, or a Druid, or a Rogue. And just like in Season 2, these things are pretty strong. Compared to most other enemies in a Helltide, these things are going to be on a different level from pretty much any other enemy in the Helltide. They're going to give you a ton of loot at the end, they can give you boss summoning materials, and they have a chance to give you the new material you'll find in Helltides. And this new material is called Baneful Hearts. And these are going to play a very similar role to the blood resource from Season 2 in Blood Harvest. It's not a material you carry on your person that's in your inventory or in your resource tab. This is going to stay within the UI of the Helltide. So when you enter a Helltide, at the top right, you'll see your cinders, and then you'll see your Baneful Hearts. Now, these Baneful Hearts are used to summon the new boss of the Helltides called a Blood Maiden. So at one point in every Helltide, there's going to be a summoning ritual with 3 different stones. Every one of those stones needs a Baneful Heart, and other players can also put in a Baneful Heart. So exactly like Blood Harvest in Season 2, you could group up a bunch of random people that are just in the zone. Multiple people could put in a heart, and you start this big event. It spawns in tons of waves of enemies, tons of elites, and then once you get to the end, it'll summon the Blood Maiden, which is a big boss that's going to drop a ton of loot. But the Blood Maiden is a ridiculously strong boss. In fact, fact, with her tuning right now, it feels like she's more towards a world boss in terms of health and in terms of damage. So you could be there solo or only with a few players. She can be very difficult right now, but it will give a warning to other players in the area, and on their map it will also be flickering, so you'll probably have other players coming over pretty early on to help you complete this because it gives a lot of loot. Now, just like Helltides have always had, you'll still be gathering up cinders from all of the enemies you kill, all of the events you go do, and these are still going to be used on all of the different random chests you'll find throughout the Helltide, so you'll still be following that pretty similar element. And these chests are ridiculous, especially with the lower drop rates that are coming with Season 4 because of all the overhauls to gear. These chests in the Helltides seem to be pretty ridiculous. The mystery chests seem to still drop a similar amount of legendary drops. They're still going to be giving you tons of materials. They're still going to be giving you living steel as we went over. And every chest you open is either going to have a chance or always going to give you a baneful heart. That's going to be the main way you obtain these hearts, but it seems like you will also be able to obtain them from the Hellborn spawns. Now, even though all of these Helltide specific changes are all incredible, just having much higher density, having the new Blood main boss to go defeat, having this threat meter that ends in a mini boss fight, they're all very good changes, but another really important factor is all of the other overhauls coming in Season 4 having a pretty positive impact on Helltides as well. Because first off, gear drops are going to be much more rare. You're not going to be getting near as many gear drops because of the massive overhaul to affixes, itemization, and gear, so you're not going to have to worry about quickly filling up your inventory with gear drops, which is a thing that would happen in Helltides as well. And since they're timed and you lose your cinders after that Helltide ends, it would feel like it's not worth to go back to town to sift through gear and then go back and lose a couple minutes every time you have to do that. So you would just end up leaving all this gear on the ground that may be good. But now you really shouldn't have difficulties doing an entire Helltide without filling up your inventory, or at least not having to go back to town. And then likewise, the changes to material drops are going to have a significant impact on Helltides. First off, being that any elites in the game can just randomly explode with tons of materials. Elites can randomly spawn with any of the crafting resources, including like Forgotten Souls. They can randomly explode with boss summoning materials. So pretty much any material in the game, elites now just have a low chance of dropping a ton of those, and you're going to be killing ridiculous amounts of elites in Helltides now. This seems to be one of the biggest changes to density, that there's just a lot more elites, especially with these hellworms constantly popping up. You'll be facing tons of elites, so just a decently high chance to see these new random procs to get a ton of materials. But they also changed some more specific drops, such as Forgotten Souls. Just killing elites around Helltides, you'll constantly be getting Forgotten Souls and other materials outside of those proc chances for elites to spew out a ton of materials. It seems like every elite, or almost every elite, is now dropping things like Forgotten Souls, Veiled Crystals, and other legendary crafting materials. So you'll just be getting a ton of the more rare crafting materials you need just from running around and destroying packs of elites in Helltides. And that's not even the only changes, because Helltides are now also going to be appearing in World Tier 1 and World Tier 2. So at the start of every new season, you'll also have the option of going into Helltides, farming up materials, and leveling up through those. And they're also going to be a little bit easier. They're not going to have the random meteor spawns and some other elements toned down a little bit. Because you're lower level, you can't deal with as much difficult content yet, but that's a pretty massive change and could potentially give another good way to level up. They're just changing up and adding more variation into leveling up. Hopefully with a bunch of these systems, leveling up now will feel much more rewarding, because you could just go to Helltides early on and start getting those early materials, because presumably you'll still be able to get all of the same materials such as living steel. You'll be able to build up your baneful hearts, especially once you get to high level. You could just use all of those baneful hearts to try to farm up much better gear as you enter into the end game, and you could start farming that stuff right from level 1. So I think this overhaul to Helltides is incredibly good. Pretty much every part of these changes has been a positive change to Helltides, and they're much more enjoyable to go do. I found myself in the PTR just going to them to farm gear instead of doing a bunch of the other pieces of endgame content, which we now have a lot more of as well. So I think they did a pretty good job on overhauling Helltides. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.